and welcome to Your Career. Ahead on the show, we'll find out what makes a great manager, and we'll speak to one of the leading lights of Australian theatre about his career. But first, with retirement moving further into the never-never, today's modern workforce can be a melting pot of up to 4 different generations. Digital native millennials are sharing coffee cups and water coolers with colleagues up to 50 years older than themselves. It can make for an interesting dynamic, and it's one that needs to be carefully managed, according to a new report by talent managers Chandler McLeod. So to discuss managing the multi-generational workforce, we're joined today by the CEO of Chandler McLeod, Cameron Judson, as well as head of Deloitte's diversity and inclusion practice, Juliet Burke, both in the studio with me today. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. I might start with you, Cameron, just get you to sort of define the lingo for those watching between, we always hear millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, Gen Y. Just give us a sort of overview. Sure.
So often the two words millennials and Gen Y are interchangeable. For me, the definition is really anyone born around the millennial. So often the technical definition is born after 1981. Generation X is born after 1965, before 1981. Baby boomers obviously after the Second World War, after 1946, and the balance of the population in work born prior to that.
So in terms of your report, it found that only half of businesses have a specific talent management strategy to deal with these multiple generations at work. Is that a mistake? Do you think every business should have some sort of strategy in place?
I don't think it's a mistake. I think it's a great opportunity. Diversity brings with it creativity and an opportunity to reach into the different skills and experience of different components of the workforce. And I think the generational challenge is no different to any other challenge around diversity and inclusion in the workplace.
Juliet, what do you think of that? Why do you need these specific strategies in place, do you think?
Well, I don't know if you do. I find that a very vexed question because a lot of the research shows that, in fact, the similarities between the age groups are greater than the differences. So calling out these individual differences can often lead to stereotypes. So I'm a bit torn, actually, as to whether you need a specific strategy or not.
But if there is some sort of conflict between sort of generations, just in terms of, I guess, the stereotypes that might play out in a workplace, how do you deal with it?
Well, I think stereotypes is an interesting choice of words because often that tells us that we don't really know what our people want from us. So whether that's within generation or across generation, the real opportunity is to understand individual motivation, individual engagement, and our people in our workplaces are looking for that from us. I think you're right, though, about making a big stereotype that says each of the generations are markedly different. There are many, many similarities at the core of what they all want from work: fulfilment, reward. But if you reach into that motivation and that engagement at an individual level, it's a great opportunity for business.
But, Juliet, is it somewhat a new phenomenon, do you think? I mean, in terms of having this big generational gap? Because, with the delayed age of retirement, we're certainly having a broader age gap in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, we've always had multi-generations in a workforce. It's just that they usually finished at, in people's 50s, but now it's extending into people's 70s. So that's why we have 4 generations in the workforce. And really, that question you're asking about conflict, maybe we need a strategy to manage the conflict. The question is, how would that conflict be generated? Do people really have that level of difference between each other? Now, look, to some degree they do. For example, those who are currently sort of late 60s, over 70, are much more monocentric in their approach to work. They're very work-centric compared to those who are Gen X, even baby boomers, much more dual-centric, valuing both work and life.
You often hear these stereotypes, in the media about millennials sort of being entitled and lazy. You hear that in a lot of sort of a stereotypical sense. You hear that the Gen X work hard and they've always worked in jobs for 20 years straight, because they didn't have the same sort of job change, I guess, in the short term. How do you sort of address that?
I think Juliet makes a really interesting point to answer that question. I think what's really changing in the workplace is this sense of identity around work and work outside, sorry, life outside work, I should say. And increasingly we're seeing all generations want greater flexibility. Their experience of flexibility is very different, though. New people joining the workforce today have an expectation up front that flexibility is part of their identity, whereas maybe older generations are getting used to greater flexibility in their workplace.
What about advantages of having a multi-generational workforce? There's obviously advantages to this. Do you want to start?
Well, I think there are huge advantages. As I said at the beginning, I think when you start thinking about the skills, experience, perspectives of all the different generations in the workplace, they bring things to the workplace around creativity, around productivity. And for me, it's about reaching down into the organisation, understanding that motivation, those skills, that experience, and how you make that productive for the organisation.
Juliet?
Look, at a very fundamental level, you are drawing from the widest possible pool of talent. I mean, that's what it's all
agree.
about instead of limiting yourself down.
Absolutely agree.
And yes, the connectivity between people is a great way of enlivening new ideas. I think the interesting thing that we do, and it's sort of the positive side of stereotypes in a way, is that we look at someone who is visibly different from us and we think they must think something different. So we ask more questions, we're more attentive to their answers.
Yep.
Exactly. So it's not necessarily age that's generating it, but our response to this visible difference.
2/3 of HR professionals, though, report some degree of intergenerational conflict in their organisations. That's according to Deloitte. So what are some of the common sources of conflict we see in the workplace then?
Yeah, and it is some degree.
Yeah.
Because once again, you know, the research is that the similarities are greater than the differences. But for example, those who are very mature in the workforce, you know, 1 in 5 of those workers will feel a sense of trepidation and difficulty being managed by someone significantly younger.
Yeah.
But it's only 1 in 5. Actually, 4 in 5 say they're very happy to be managed by someone who is significantly younger and think that they're competent. So there are little conflicts between people based on assumptions of competency, based on where you are in your life course. And that, for me, is a bigger issue.
What about in terms of pay? Do older people tend to think they should be paid more? They're entitled to a higher pay than some, you know, 24-year-old? I mean, is that how it sort of works in the workplace in terms of mindset?
No, I don't think there's a mindset like that.
Okay.
I think often there's a discussion around, I bring these skills, this experience to the organisation. The organisation will benefit for me applying those skills, experience and qualifications maybe. And that's really the value conversation. I don't think there's a mindset or a stereotype around if you're older you get paid more.
I guess the older you are,
you
you could have had more experience, so that could back that up.
If it's relevant and can be applied to the workplace.
Exactly. So how should management strategies differ then for each generation, or should they differ at all, Juliet?
Well, that's my point of view, is that actually I don't think there should be. I think we should focus on inclusion of everyone.
Yep.
And I think where we should enter this roundabout is thinking about the stereotypes. Because younger workers get stereotyped as being, as you said before, potentially lazy and, you know, self-centred and all of that. Older workers get, you know, incompetent, you know, can't, actually same stereotype, but just two ends of the spectrum. So for me, it is actually addressing those, because then stereotypes are never true for the majority. You know, you can always find a single example.
It's a lazy lens, right?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think it's a lazy lens in that I think there are differences between generations, but there's more that they have in common in terms of their needs from work. But you do need to step into that conversation with your employees and ask what they want of their experience of being led and managed and what they want from their workplace.
Is there a difference in working up the ranks in terms of being an older generation or a younger generation? You know, in terms of who gets the top job? Do they often give it to someone who has, you know, further, from a mindset point of view and from a stereotypical point of view, someone who has further to go in their career than someone older?
No, I don't think that's a fair assessment.
Yep.
I think there should be a conversation about merit.
Which is a good thing. I mean, that's ideal, but is that how it is in real life?
Well, I think you need to talk about individual experience in individual organisations. So we could deal with stereotypes or we could talk about individual experience. My experience is that often merit, well represented, well understood, and easily demonstrated will win over any preconceived or stereotypical ideas. In
terms of communication, there's one that comes up a bit with intergenerations. Social media, often, you know, is it up to the older generation to just get across all social media and technology that they may not have been across as well as the younger generation? I mean, is that up to them just to sort of skill up?
So assuming that they're not, I mean, that's
assuming
with your,
exactly right.
You are assuming, and that is one of the stereotypes. I mean, I think the research shows that it's only those people who are sort of in their late 60s, going into 70s, that have a preference for picking up the telephone in comparison to the younger generation. But you know, baby boomers and Gen X, that's the majority of the workforce, are socially adept in terms of social media, just as younger generations are. I don't see the difference.
No, and I would probably agree with you there, but I'm just saying in terms of stereotypes, I mean, that is something that people tend to think.
I think to build on Juliet's point, though, it's only those that don't have any real experience with technology that maybe that's true for. My experience in the workplace is that employers expect you to engage a whole range of means to communicate with them, social media being one of them. It's a really good medium to get a message to an audience, but nothing actually beats face-to-face contact in my own experience.
For anyone.
For anyone.
And that's
exactly.
what your report showed, is that actually we assume that younger generations are more interested in communicating via social media, but also human, and we like that interaction.
Absolutely.
A lot more we could say here, but we'll have to leave it there. Cameron Judson and Juliette Burke, thanks so much for joining us on the show today.
Pleasure.
We do have to take a quick break, but coming up, we'll discover the characteristics of great managers and get an insight into the career of one of Australian theatre's brightest stars. We'll speak to Ralph Myers next.